Last week we talked about video games from the 2000s that still held up graphically, but this time we're here to talk about 10 games from the 90s that graphically still hold up. Starting off with number 10, squeaking in at the tail end of the 90s is Gran Turismo 2. Both the original game and especially its sequel really pushed the original PS1 to the limit, and GT2 was one of the best looking car games. Cars had a realistic shine to them, courses, cars, and objects were extremely realistically proportionate, and on certain tracks the sunsets and general sunlight were bright with almost real looking lens flares. The rally races, in particular, we remember playing endlessly for the sense of speed, the game's smooth motion, and the realistic looking dirt tracks. The game also had great camera angles and the awesome instant replay of races. That added to the value of the overall look. The game is way more pixelated today, but still completely playable. You can see the cars and the tracks clearly, and it was really the start of the racing game genre just becoming absolute monster powerhouses in the graphics department. Now at number 9, we have System Shock 2. Yes, the game that pretty much made BioShock exist. System Shock nails the tone it's going for here. That, mixed with its graphic style and the spookiness of the space station, all work together great. Yeah, in many ways, the darker and more hidden in shadow some of the stuff is, the better concealed all the crappy parts are, but hey, it works in System Shock's favor. The stuff that is well lit is filled with tons of detail, all in an environment you can fully traverse. It's one of the games on here that scores extra points for being ahead of its time, but play it today and you'll still have no problem diving in because the look and feel really holds up that well.
Transform you into something more efficient. Join me, human. And we can move. And we can move together.
At number 8, let's talk about 2 games from the same series. There's The Neverhood, and then there's Skull Monkeys. These games are really special, but they're often forgotten about. They are a labor of love, and they look so damn good. Using real clay models and photography and tricks, these games still to this day look like nothing else out there. That's specifically why we're highlighting these. 1996, The Neverhood was a point-and-click adventure full of weird, gross 90s whimsicalness, and 1998 sequel Skull Monkeys went in a different direction as a platformer. At the time, every game was desperate to make the jump to clunky 3D, and The Neverhood and Skull Monkeys stuck to more of an ageless medium. Technically, yeah, it's FMV, but it's still a graphical style choice, and the games still look damn cool even now. And sometimes style ages like a fine wine. Next, number 7, SimCity rules, man. In its heyday, it was the pioneer of the city builder genre. 1993's SimCity 2000 for many was the big one. And at a glance, graphically, it still works great because of the amount of detail packed on screen. I mean, look at this. The amount of on-screen busyness was insane, but still is completely perfectly telegraphed on screen. You know what's going on, not like a lot of games of that time period, which were completely smudgy looking or overly dark or even just extremely pixelated. SimCity kept things a bit more classic, and just like some other games on this list, just adding some 90s power to older style games works wonders and gives the graphics more longevity. Next, at number 6, we have Grim Fandango. When people talk about the games that Double Fine's Tim Schafer has made, they usually stick to the more recent stuff, Brutal Legend, Costume Quest, and of course Psychonauts. It's pretty easy to forget that before the Double Fine days, he was a developer at the now defunct LucasArts and worked on another super stylish adventure game, Grim Fandango. Now, LucasArts made a lot of really good-looking adventure games. I mean, Day of the Tentacle, the Monkey Island games, but Grim Fandango is one that we feel holds up the best, due in part to its incredibly effective style. That initial inspiration formed a rock-solid foundation for this game, and it can be seen in pretty much every environment and a ton of character models as you go through Manny's journey in the Land of the Dead. When you go back to this era of games, it's pretty common for them to age poorly, but the visuals of Grim Fandango really do manage to hold up, and it's all in part to it taking a more stylistic approach, rather than trying to go realistic. The game was remastered in 2015, but even there, it was mostly improvements in detail and lighting, as the low-poly character models and pre-rendered backgrounds didn't need a whole lot to translate to a new generation. It's definitely easier to get running than the original though, so if you haven't had the chance yet, you absolutely should because it's one of the coolest looking games of that era. And at number 5, Shenmue made it onto this list by the skin of its teeth, what with it being released on December 29th, 1999, but that still sounds good enough, so we're going to talk about it. Now, a lot of early Dreamcast games looked good, especially when compared to other games at the time, considering its initial competition was the Nintendo 64 and OG PlayStation. But Shenmue really did feel like something else. Now, the world you explore in Shenmue is relatively small, and that's fine because the developers took the time to make that small town feel dense with stuff to find and incredibly detailed. It was the first game I remember playing that you could just walk around town and walk up to a vending machine on the street and buy stuff, or go into a room and sift through the drawers, actually opening them to see what was physically inside. And that little detail was all over the place. It wasn't simply in that one room that's like, okay, here's where you're meant to look around, leaving the rest of the world lifeless and barren. The cinematic framing of cutscenes and the implementation of QuickTime events, QTEs, was also really ahead of its time, and even going back now still feels very modern, which is an impressive feat all on its own. Now, sure, that level of detail is incredibly common in 2019, but in 1999, that was pretty mind-blowing. And at number 4, we have Myst. It may seem wild if you weren't there for this part of video game history, but the jump from old floppy disk-based media to the CD-ROM era was absolutely nuts. Multimedia gaming was finally a big thing, meaning that you had more room for data and could do stuff like run video games, bring in actual music as opposed to old MIDI files, and not only that, but render out old 3D designs as static bitmaps, and not only that, but render them out at a bunch of different camera angles and then get everything working together with HyperCard. Now granted, the advent of CD-ROM gaming didn't also ramp up your computer's processing power, so you couldn't yet just walk around 3D worlds like you can today, shifting the camera around a character the whole time, but you were able to fake it with some technical trickery, letting you click around to different anchor points and giving you a pretty convincing illusion of being in an actual 3D space rather than a series of 3D rendered images, and it was absolutely awesome at the time. And it didn't just rely on looking great. The developer, Cyan Worlds, but more accurately the two brothers, Robin and Rand Miller, were able to make it a legitimately fantastic adventure and puzzle game, which was a real feat, as a lot of the early games of the CD-ROM era were criticized for being all style and no substance. So the fact that two people were able to make one that not only stood out at the time, but still has people like us talking about it almost 30 years later, it's pretty damn impressive if you ask me. Moving on to number 3, we have Metal Gear Solid, which, yes, we know that strictly from a graphical standpoint, it doesn't look amazing, but there's no denying how cinematic this game is. The way certain shots are framed make it seem like it's straight out of a movie. That's what really stands out with this game, especially at the time this game came out. There weren't many other games that were doing what Metal Gear was doing. This is something that carried on to all of its sequels, to the point of actually kind of being funny with the amount of cutscenes there are in Metal Gear Solid 4. The mood and atmosphere here still really hold up even today and makes this game super replayable, especially if you love super cinematic anime. And at number 2, we have Donkey Kong Country, which might be the best looking SNES game of all time. The way this game looks is actually pretty impressive for the time and the hardware that it was running on. Everything here is so bright and colorful and almost feels like you're watching a cartoon at times. There are also a lot of little animations that I don't think go unnoticed necessarily, but I don't think I realized how impressive they were until I actually took the time to look at them. Think about when Diddy Kong runs, for example, the way his hat bounces as he moves, and how it starts to come off his head when you jump, or when you finish a bonus area and he throws it up in the air while winking. Donkey Kong's idle animation as well, where he just sits there and looks around for a few seconds before standing up to pound on his chest. Enemies and objects are all animated very well also. It's all pretty impressive for a game that was released in 1994. Finally, at number 1, we have Tekken 3. The 90s were chock full of good-looking fighting games, and choosing one is difficult, but for this one, we had to go with 1997's Tekken 3. Now, before we get to all of the cool details that make this game look so good, it's worth noting that Tekken 3 was the first time Namco used actual motion capture technology in one of its fighting games, instead of just developing character animations from scratch, which is a big deal considering that the whole game involves dudes punching each other. The game ran at a rock-solid 60 frames per second, a feat that a ton of games in 2019 still struggle to accomplish, especially console ports, but this game kept it stable throughout, which made it an absolute joy to play. The game also included the use of textured polygons rather than the shaded polygons, which were very popular at the time, but resulted in a much better looking model overall. I mean, just look at this thing. We take it for granted today, but getting a near arcade perfect port of a 3D fighting game was a huge deal in the mid-90s, and the PlayStation Tekken 3 in particular still hangs with the best of them as far as looks and playability of console ports goes, having solid character models and environments and fast, fluid combat that's just as good today as it was at release. And those are 10 games from the 90s that graphically still hold up, but we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments and let us know what you think. As I'm sure you already know, hitting the like button really helps us out, and if you're new here, subscribing is a good idea, because we put out videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for stopping by to hang out with us, we really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time, right here on Gameranx.